Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mingyong Son, PhD in musicology, and I'm currently affiliated at Asian Music Research Institute. Thank you all for being here today, even if it's very hot, and all for your attendance until this final session. I will be moderating here today, and also I will lead a discussion on the Contemporary Korean Music Research Network. The theme for our session is exploring contemporary Korean music, from traditional to classical to K-pop and everything in between, which will be further explained by Professor Anna H. Lu later today. And in our music session today, we are pleased to welcome 3 international scholars for their presentations. First, we have Professor Anna H. Lu from Seoul National University, followed by Professor Keith Howard from SOAS University of London, UK, and Professor Nancy Yuna Lau from Locust University in the United States. Our session will proceed as follows. First, we will watch a 10-minute video overview of our project presented by Professor Anna H. Lu. After her video, the other 2 presenters will each speak for 30 minutes, followed by a 20-minute Q&A and discussion session, which we invite all of the audience to actively participate in. Following that, I will introduce our first speaker, Professor Anna H. Lu. She is assistant professor in ethnomusicology in the Department of Korean Music since 2020. She completed her PhD on the traditional Korean song storytelling art form pansori, titled Pansori Today, Reconciling Tradition and Creativity in Modern Society at SOAS, University of London. She is also active as a pansori teacher and performer both in Europe and in Korea, having been trained by National Intangible Cultural Property No. 5 disciples Min Hae-sung. She has published widely on the promotion and preservation of Korean traditional music, further exploring themes such as gender, fashion, and social media use amongst traditional musicians. So today, she will talk on overview of our collaborative project titled How Has Contemporary Korean Music Research Developed? Intercultural Korean Music Research, Korean Music in the World, Traditional, Classical, Popular Music. Please join us in giving her a warm round of applause.
Hello, my name is Anna H. Lu. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Korean Music here at Seoul National University, as well as the head of the Contemporary Korean Music Research Team. As such, it's my great pleasure to take this moment to talk to you about the work that we've been doing. Unfortunately, I'm not able to present that to you in person, but I wanted at least like this through video to greet you. Thank you all for being here, as well as thanking both our collaborators and our 2 presenters here today for the work that they've been doing so far. So let me talk you through what we've been doing. First things first, where did we come from? How did we start out with the research that we've been doing? So a lot of research obviously has been done for a long time regarding Korean music. We can go back at least to the 15th century with the Akak, if not even earlier. What has, however, emerged over time is that the various different disciplinary strands of research on Korean music have tended to develop rather separately, and there hasn't been that much interdisciplinary exchange over time. Because music research is an area that's often quite strongly underrepresented in Korean studies conferences, there is really a need for these different disciplinary approaches to come together, to interact, to share information, and as such to strengthen the research that they've been doing. So this is what we've been hoping to do. We've got a starting point here with the groups that we have with us, which will hopefully develop further in the future. But as of now, the group that we have coming together are scholars and practitioners covering areas of research in traditional Korean as well as Western classical and popular music, using musicological, ethnomusicological, anthropological, practice-based, to name but a few, research methods in their work. And as will become very important and apparent, I think, is that we can't define Korean music as being limited just to Korean borders. In fact, we very actively try to avoid that in the group of researchers we've put together. So these diasporic and international experiences being very important to how we think about Korean music. And also to make sure we're not staying stuck in our ivory tower, but we've also included insights from not just exclusively academic viewpoints, but from practitioners as well, to provide as wide and broad a possible perspective as we can for starting point in terms of this discussion. So it's very difficult to find overarching headings for these various areas of research that we're looking at. I have chosen 3 potential subheadings as of now, but these may shift as we continue our discussions. And this is part of the joy of what we've been doing with our research, that we can see how they fit together in a variety of different ways. So the first subheading that I've got is looking at expanding the boundaries of Korean music research. And this is both in a methodological sense as well as in a geographical sense as well. So I'll talk about our presenter, Keith Howard, a bit more in a moment. For now, to introduce our other collaborators, I myself am looking at changing perceptions of gender in new Changguk performances, Changguk being traditional Korean singing pansori-derived modern musical theatre. Our next contributor, Roald Maliankai from Australian National University, provides very fascinating research on playback formats and how the physical culture of music consumption can affect concepts of legitimacy in Korean music enthusiasm. From a more conceptual expansion of boundaries, we move into a geographic expansion of boundaries, where we have Donnelly Kwon from the University of Kentucky, looking at strategies of sustainability in Korean drumming scenes in the United States. We then have Chorong Sung from SOAS in London, looking at the Korean music scene in the UK, how it has developed, how perceptions of Korea and its music have developed over time. And then in mainland Europe, we have Han Yumi, the head of the KVOX Festival in Paris, who is looking from the perspective of now the 21st century at process of creating a pansori audience in France. Our next subheading that we have is the concepts of interculturality and transnationalism, which has been an area of interest for quite a few of our contributors. Again, I will take more time to introduce our second speaker after this general introduction. Other contributors in this category, we have Woo Hee-suk, also my colleague here at Seoul National University, who's looking in broader conceptual terms at interculturality in contemporary Korean music. And then we also have So Min-kyung from Harvard University, who is looking at concepts of transnationality and ideas what exactly composition or collaboration or innovation can mean, looking particularly at 21st century Korean female performers' compositions in the US. Then our final area of research, as I have summarized it so far, is looking at music and cultural policy. And this is both in the international sense as well as the impact on the Korean music scene locally here within Korea as well. So our first collaborator in this category is Kim Hee-sun from Kookmin University, who gives a historical overview looking at the global Cold War and how Korean music was used in cultural policy during this time, and how the experiences of that time still very much color what is being done in cultural policy today. Sidebrao Saiji from Busan National University looks at the popular music scene and how traditional music and culture holders are potentially sidelined by the current cultural policy strategies that very much make use of pop stars for promoting Korean culture. Finally, we have Kim Ho-jung from Chungang Daily, who gives a perspective from her long experience reporting on the Korean music scene of how the competition circuit impacts the potential for development and promotion and activity amongst Korean classical musicians within Korea. So quickly to summarize a couple of the emerging themes just from the headlines alone, obviously more to follow as our discussions continue to develop over time. I've already mentioned this. I think this is very much the most important point of what we're seeing so far, is that Korean music cannot be spoken of as only taking place within Korea, nor is it something that's being done only by Koreans. And this is something we very much need to think about and explore in terms of what that means for Koreanness as a whole. Now, there's a very clear interest in many researchers amongst concepts of transnationalism and interculturalism as various collaborative performances have taken place. And also a growing consciousness of the power dynamics involved here, which I think will be a very interesting area for future discussion. Obviously, in general, as Korean music research is maturing, we're seeing a much wider range of topics and this interdisciplinary overlap, which is what we're really trying to achieve through this project. One example of that is perhaps the exploration of traditional music's interaction with the Western classical music scene. So, for example, how concepts of composition and so on are being problematized through this interaction of different musical cultures. And so I'm hoping that this will become the starting point for more constructive discussion in both the Korean music scene and wider Korean studies as a whole. Now, I want to take the remaining time to quickly introduce our presenters. Our first presenter is Keith Howard, who is a professor emeritus at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And he's going to be using his more than 40 years researching traditional Korean music for his presentation, Shifts and Stasis in the Promotion of Kugak, Observing and Interacting with the Korean Traditional Music World, 1979 to 2024. And he uses his experience of this long time looking at traditional Korean music to explore changing trends both in what is considered the scope of Kugak as well as what is considered appropriate methodology for researching. So thank you very much, and we're very much looking forward to hearing his presentation. And then our second presenter, Nancy Yunha Rao, is a distinguished professor at the Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University. Now, she's very influential in her research on cross-cultural music, which is also what she's talking about with us today. But she's also well known for research in musical modernism, early Chinese American music history, and many more. So her presentation is titled Classicism and Inter-Asian Collaboration in Contemporary Music. And she will be exploring two case studies evoking Asia's shared classical past in 21st century musical language. And you can see there are the two case studies there. So we're very much looking forward to very different approaches, touching on very different topics to showcase at least some of the diversity of Korean music research. So thank you very much to our presenters. Thank you to you for being here and listening to us today. And I look forward to many fruitful discussions in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor H. Lu, for providing a very detailed and clear overview of our entire project, and also introduce two presenters instead of me. And now let's move on to Professor Howard. And Professor Howard, we talk about shift and status in the promotion of Kugak, observing and interacting with Korean music from 1979 throughout 2024. Let's extend our warm welcome and appreciation with a round of applause.
Thank you very much. So I'm not talking about contemporary Korea, really. I'm going back to tradition. But I start by saying that I'm dedicating this talk to the memory of my PhD student, Alex Leonzini, who was studying as a fellow at the Kujangak, just over here, went out of touch on the 1st of August, and her body was found last week. She was a very promising scholar working on North Korean music, particularly revolutionary opera from Perth, Australia. Her family are here in Seoul, working on repatriating her body. So, my talk is because Kugak is being promoted as part of Korea Today. And last month, paragraph 1 of the National Kugak Promotion Act stipulated how traditional music, dance, and plays should be promoted in the future. A Kugak Expo is planned for the beginning of next year, an international expo. And so the question is, how can the Kugak world not just be Kugak from the past, but develop the vitality of Kugak in Korea and abroad in the future? My first encounter with Kugak was in 1979 at the Durham Oriental Music Festival, a festival held 3 times, 76, 79, 82, set up by a musicologist who was interested in Indonesian music, Eric Taylor, and run as secretary by Keith Pratt, then a lecturer in Chinese, who'd visited Korea in 1972. And he'd been so impressed by the generosity of leading Korean musicians that Korea became a major part of the Durham Oriental Music Festival. And in fact, it was one of the first profiling of Kugak to the Western world. In 1979, I was a composer, but I was a student helper tasked with assisting visiting Korean musicians, one of whom was Han Man-yong. You can see him there. He was an invited lecturer. And then in 1982, Lee Hae-gu, 1908 to 2010, attended and was awarded an honorary doctorate by Durham University. Now, the Oriental Music Festival stood at a sort of nexus of British and European engagement with other musics. Now, by the late 1970s, essentially musicology had started to shift, long centered on Western classical music and on the analysis of musical structures and forms. It began to fracture essentially as sociologists, anthropologists, and media specialists turned to popular music study. At the same time, the more Orientalist forms of scholarship had begun to be challenged by ethnomusicologists who argued the need to understand social, cultural, and geographical forces. Record labels had long labeled, say, African music or Asian music as something almost comical. But that changed in the 1970s as some really wonderful ethnographic recordings came out, such as the 2 on the left, the bottom one from Bali, particularly the Bali Kecak, and then Tibetan Buddhism. Indian music was known, but not many other musics. But by the late 1970s, these were being taken as things to be studied, to be looked at, to be explored. For those of you who know something like Keith Jarrett, just as by way of an extension, if you listen to his Cologne concert and then go away and listen to Ravi Shankar, you'll see a huge connection. So it was there. And my composition teacher at the time, David Lumsdaine, required me to listen to those 2 albums and essentially to try to get me out of my Western thinking. At the same time, Robert Provine discovered my interest in other sound worlds and introduced me to Kugak. So the Oriental Music Festival essentially promoted distinctiveness, high watermarks, classical and historical traditions, and Kugak was a very good fit. But neoliberalism and populism was challenging this. And so in 1982, the last of the 3 festivals, that was when the first WOMAD, the World of Music and Arts and Dance Festival, was launched. And in 1982, the musicians of the Nile, there on the top left, went to Durham and then travelled down to WOMAD. But at WOMAD, not just or instead of the sort of high watermark classical musics, WOMAD featured people like Don Cherry and pop groups, Echo and the Bunnymen, Simple Minds. So, if I reflect back on 45 years, European and North American musicology has seen remarkable shifts and changes. It's changed in many ways beyond expectations. But Kugak, and more precisely the paradigmatic methodology for Kugak research, Kugak-hak or Kugak-iron, remains much as it was. Now, the methodology, Kugak-hak, was largely developed by Ihegu. And Lee, he knew German Musikwissenschaft and comparative musicology and some Japanese musicology, but he was actually an English literature graduate. And in the 1930s, he was a producer for the Keijo Broadcasting Company, the radio station set up by the Japanese colonialists. And in that job, he met and produced many Kugak musicians. And so his research methodology matched the foreign to a Confucian, Korean Confucian respect for history. It was nationalistic but also modern. And his methodology has five main elements. There they are: translating and annotating historical texts, notating court music from both the past and the present, comparing historical sources to determine origins, development, and change, defining musical parameters, mode, rhythm, this sort of thing, and aesthetics. On the right, the first collection of his papers, Hangokumak Yongu from 1957. 2 years after that was produced, that book, here at Seoul National, the first Kugak degree was set up, 1959. And Ihegu was in charge of it, and he worked with senior musicians from what we now know as the Kugagwan, the National Kugak Center, Song Yong-nin, Chang Se-hun, Kim Chun-hung, members of what had been founded in 1948, the Hanguk Kugak Hakwe, and surprisingly, someone called Hwang Byung-gi, who many of you will have heard of. He'd actually majored in law at SNU, not music, but while he was studying, he also studied sanjo, and to perform a genre of Kugak. Now, at that time, people from the Kugagwan didn't have degrees, so they couldn't become permanent lecturers here, faculty members. Hence, Hwang Byung-gi was appointed as a lecturer in Kugak. And today, the multiple Kugak degree programs in South Korea retain much of the Seoul National curriculum and much of the methodology for studying Kugak, because most were set up by Lee's students or by students of his students. There was, at that point, a lot of similarity between what I'm going to call historical ethnomusicology, after a paper by Richard Willis from 1992, and Kugak study. And the historical ethnomusicology was led in Harvard University by Rulan Xiaopian. One of her students was Robert Provine. And at Cambridge University, it was led by Lawrence Pickin, one of his students who studied Korea and later became a Buddhist and ran a bakery and various other things, was Jonathan Condit. So Robert Provine, well, first of all, Jonathan Condit in 1976 gave a lecture at the Durham Oriental Music Festival. And a year later, both he and Lawrence Pickin wrote papers on the right there for Chang Se-hun, the scholar and musician, his 60th birthday Festschrift. At Durham University, Robert Provine was appointed in 1978 as a lecturer to work with Keith Pratt, and you can see some of their works. So Provine writing about the sacrifice to Confucius. So it obviously goes back to Sejong's time, and the treatise on ceremonial music in the Annals, so of King Sejong. He also translated essays by Ihegu, which is the book on the right that came out in 1981, and Provine's main book is about early sources for Korean ritual music. Keith Pratt, as a lecturer in Chinese, had gone back to the 11th century and the exchange of music and instruments and musicians and dancers, incidentally, from the Chinese song court in 1114 and 1116. So, that's fine, but there's also different approaches between the historical ethnomusicologists and what Kugak specialists were doing. So East Asian scholars are primarily concerned with a tradition retained or rediscoverable today, and they explore historical records to substantiate contemporary practice. But historical ethnomusicologists tend to regard their research as simply historical. So Lawrence Pickin, in the introduction to the first volume of Music from the Tang Court, criticized the eminent Japanese musicologist Hayashi Kenzo, who, he wrote, found it difficult, if not impossible, to escape from the performance tradition as it survives today. In contrast, Pickin says, our method is the study and transcription of the earliest sources, deliberately ignoring the living tradition and performance practice of today. Condit, Jonathan Condit, in an analysis of 4 versions of the court orchestral piece, Yomilak, which is to do with the poetry composed with the founding of Hangul, criticized Ihegu, whose own study of Yomilak, he stated, is problematic in that it interprets all the scores according to the modern reading of the mensural notation. Now, the difference is critical here because the Kugak scholars were trying to establish Kugak as something for Korea today. And if we look at, these are translations obviously in English, of Ihegu's approach to what he was doing, these are beautiful statements about what music is. Just look at the first one. Music which is slow to this extent requires a special hand technique, just as in the case of drawing huge strokes with a writing brush in gigantic calligraphy. Or one thinks of music like the tolling of a bell in a distant Buddhist monastery. Taepyeongga, a vocal duet singing of the harmony in Elysium. The lyrical shijo, like a swelling wave. Dignified court music, like a mountain with its peak shining serene in the in the sun above the cloud of passion. They have different functions. Not surprisingly, or perhaps it was surprisingly, Kugak has had considerable success here, or Kugak Hak, the study of Kugak. By 1981, Songbang Song, the Korean with the best ever name for a musicologist, Songbang Song, he could cite 1,278 publications on Kugak. By 1985, there had been 199 dissertations, Soksa MA dissertations. 64% were on court music. But the success of Kugak and Kugak Hak came partly because of the study of Kugak here at SNU and at other universities, partly because of the National Kugak Center, which remains, I think, the largest sort of state-supported institute for national music, certainly in Asia. And thirdly, because Korea from the 1960s onwards appointed intangible cultural properties, Muyongmunhaje, or now national heritages. Now, this is significant because if you think of North Korea, Kugak is not important. So you could see the two Koreas going in separate directions, but it was not inevitable that traditional music and what we associate with Kugak today would remain in a present Korea. And there's a quote there from the director of the Isangyun Music Institute, who I interviewed in 1990. Art should reflect the current times and has a duty to lead people into the future. But Kugak was actually founded on something else. It was founded on something back in the 1920s. And I'm going to skip over this. It's relevant, but it's difficult to explain. But what a lot of people call a sort of loose grouping, the Munhwa Undong, the cultural nationalists, from which we get the Iguangsu treaties, but also the development of Korean folklore with people like Che Nam-son, Lee Nung-hwa, Son Jin-hae, and Song Sok-ha. Now, why I don't want to go into that very much is because kugak started out, and the whole methodology is based on court music. Court music in a broader context, chongak, which means court and aristocratic or literati music. Intriguingly, kugak has never become a commercial thing. Despite what people will tell you, it is not commercialized. Never has been. I've just got some statistics here from 2014, when the South Korean government provided about $48 million for subsidy for the year. And in the same year, look at the amount it subsidized the National Theatre, $29 million roughly. And the National Theatre was home to the National Opera Company, the Kungnip Changgukdam, the National Dance Company, the Kungnip Muyongdan, and the National Kugak Orchestra, the Kungnip Kugak Kwanhyonakdan. In the same year, the government also subsidized 2 schools for training kugak people before university, the middle and high schools, which were originally set up by the National Center in 1954, the Kugak Yangsongso. Now, 1981 was when I first came to Korea, and that year was when the International Folk Music Council, now called the International Council for Traditional Music and Dance, held its World Congress here, the first time it had ever held a Congress in Asia, anywhere. It was founded in London in 1949, but the local arrangements chair was Han Man-yong. So, a week before the conference, the English editor who'd been hired to help kugak scholars prepare their papers for the conference walked out. And I was here, not doing that, I was learning Changanori, but I was asked to step in, which is a wonderful way to find out about kugak iron or kugak hak, because I had to help the scholars with their papers, edit their papers, but then rehearse with them, because they were all going to present in English. We have Lee Hae-gu and Chang Sa-hun, the original scholars, if you like, and then the first generation of students to graduate from Seoul National, Lee Chae-suk, Kwon Ha-sung, Kim Chong-ja, Lee Byung-won, and Song Bang-song. Now, the 2 central musicologists, Lee and Chang, Robert Provine, in his article on what is Korean music, says, they focused on court music due to the richness of untapped source materials and personal preferences. That's in their background. And actually, if you look at the 1950s, kugak was court music. Here's one of the early films by Kim Ki-young, Yangsando from 1955. If you listen to the soundtrack is primarily court music. And yet the story is about rural Korea in the 19th century, where typical story of the son of the Yangban wants to court the beautiful woman who is in love with the poorest man in the village. Now, that sort of thing. So let's just reflect on that for a moment, because Koreans in the 1950s, early 1950s, didn't know court music. The court had been closed to them. And most Koreans came from the working class, the peasantry, etc. Pieces that are there from Yongsan Huesang, the suite, and Chonyeon Mansei related to it, Suryongum for Tanso and Senghwang, Chongsonggok for solo Taegum. Now, someone somewhere recognized there was a problem. It's in the poster, but the problem was that people would not know that music. They would want something else. And so whether it was the director or someone else, I do not know, but 2 folk musicians were brought in. One was Kim Hyun-dok, pictured there playing both the Kaegum and Kumungo, the 2 zithers, and the other was a pansori singer, Park Cho-wol. And Park Cho-wol just sings twice, and very short episodes, halfway through and at the end. And since we've lost the end of the film, you can't go away and hear her. But okay, so that was more familiar. And if we think what happened to kugak scholarship, well, the students, the first generation of students and students beyond that, started to broaden what they were looking at. Han Man-yong studied Buddhist music for his PhD and is known for his work on folk songs. Ichesuk Sanjo, Kwanasong, folk songs, court music, North Korean music, the court and literati music, the Chongak from Kim Chong-ja, and Buddhist music and aesthetics from Lee Byung-won. However, the broadening of Kugak was already in place when the Seoul National Degree started in 1959. And it was in place for a slightly curious reason. And the reason is because performance students had to match what Western instrumental students, performance students, were doing. So if you were studying the piano or the violin, and still today, and some of you will have children who do this, or you will have done it, you'll learn a bit of Bach, Baroque. You'll learn some Beethoven, classical, and you'll learn some modern, 20th century, Debussy or something like that. So for Kugak, the performance thing had to be Chongak, Minsogak, folk music, and contemporary music. New traditional music, Changjak Kugak, which unfortunately hardly existed. And so composers were recruited to create pieces for the performers, and as the performers became professionals or faculty of other universities, for them in their yearly recitals. You got the beginning of a circular mode of exchange, if you like, which avoided the commercial aspect. But Kugak needed to be promoted, and so it became a concert culture. And we can see the statistics here that in the 1950s, there were only 55 concerts listed anywhere. In the 1960s, that went up to 130. In the 70s, 109. And then it exploded in 1981 because of the International Folk Music Council Congress and other things, but there were 81 events or concerts. If we look forward to the 90s, 1992, the yearbook lists 2,048 events. 1998, I haven't put these together, but it's 4,500 events or something like that. So a massive explosion in the amount of Kugak that was available. To supply that, the National Kugak Center had to rethink its policy. As a successor to court institutes that go back at least to the 8th century in various formats, in 1953, temporarily they brought in Kim Yun-dok, and later he went back, so for Sanjo, if you like. 1973 was when they brought in the first pansori singer onto their staff, and that was Park Dong-jin, who died in 2003, known for the full-length pansoris from the mid-1960s, and also a new pansori called The Song of Jesus. If anyone wants to ask me, I will tell you why he became a Christian. It's a wonderful story. Then in 1984, quite curiously, they brought in samonori. And samonori, as many of you will know, is a genre that only premiered in South Korea in 1978. May go back in terms of a lot of its musical constructs. And when they brought samonori in, they had some trouble because many of the samonori is 4 percussionists, 3 refused to join. They had been part of demonstrations against the government, the military government. 1 did, Kim Yong-bae. And he had to have other musicians who came to join him from the center staff. It didn't work. And the first samonori group there was much of a disaster, basically. And 2 years later, he committed suicide. And finally, Kugak brought in what tends to be called Kugak fusion. Fusions of East and West, particularly pop fusions. And you can see it's 1999. So Kugak as a concept is broadening. But as it broadens, so some of the scholars and the musicians get concerned. Han Man-yong, for instance, he gets concerned for a different reason. He didn't get a job in academia to start with, so he went into KBS, where he's a producer, particularly for folk song programs. In 1974, he's one of the only musicians I know who appears on a national postage stamp. There it is on the right, playing an instrument that he couldn't play. Never mind. For many years, he was a member of the Cultural Properties Committee, appointing or recommending for appointment the intangible cultural properties. But he became a Christian in 1978, sorry, after he recovered from throat cancer. And that gave him a problem with looking at Buddhist music, folk songs, shaman music. The quote at the bottom, "We have a healthy cultural heritage, but we have also chosen to preserve traditions that, to my mind, are not so healthy." You can think of the rest there and see it there. Shaman rituals can be kept in documents or films and archives. I think this is enough. Interesting. Kugak Hak, the study of Kugak, had to broaden. And from court music, the same 5 elements were put into folk music. But to start with, when we look at the earliest Kugak scholars writing about folk songs, Ihegu, for instance, they analyze recordings. They don't go and record them themselves. They don't go into the countryside. Han Manyong started to do that, but he was keen to analyze the modal constructions to delineate regional styles, rather like Taege and the famous distinctions of Koreans in the different parts of Korea. And he mapped those styles onto the dialect areas. Han also took what had been preserved as a Muyong Monaje in folk songs and folk styles as the authoritative inherited form, which may be very different from what was sung in the countryside, simply because the Muyong Monaje needs to be performed on stages. He also set up a folk song notation series with the Academy of Korean Studies, you can see at the bottom there, which enables analysis and comparison, but actually tends to remove ornamentation and melodic pitches that aren't in the preordained structures, the modal melodic structures. So on the right, just 2 quotes, one from Han Manyong, who writes that he corrects his folk song transcriptions because of the wide margin of acceptable pitches. In other words, the singers can get it wrong. And Kwon Song says much the same. He simplified his transcriptions because the singers he recorded weren't professional singers, and so they sang with undifferentiated ornamentation. Okay, let me just come to Sanjo as another element of this broadening. And one of the first people who is important here is Lee Jae-suk. On the left is her recording of the 6 major Sanjo schools, which she did as she retired. In 1948, a book came out by a former director of the Court Institute called Ham Hwa-jin, in which he said that Sanjo was invented by Kim Chang-jo. There he is. Kim Chang-jo died before any recordings could be made. So how do you get to a Sanjo history? Well, one way is through his relatives. In the 1930s, Kim Juk-pa had appeared on KBS radio, Japanese colonial one, in programs produced by Ihegu, so he knew her. She then married and was forced to give up performance, and only came back to the stage after the death of her second husband in about 1977-78. I'd need to check that. But when Lee Jae-suk was studying at Seoul National here with Ihegu, Ihegu told her, well, I know this person. She's wonderful. Go and see if you can study with her. And so we got a continuation from the first generation, the founder, through the second generation, to beyond the third generation. It was actually the third generation that gave us the first people appointed within the Muyong Monaje system. Kim Yun-dok was one of them, who we've seen on the film and things. And this came from Kim Chang-jo through the second generation who had recorded, and 2 people in particular, An Kyok, Chong Nam-hee, normally considered his students, although Chong actually learned from An. The problem for South Koreans was that both An Kyok and Chong Nam-hee had settled in North Korea. And so their names couldn't be mentioned until after No Mu-hyun came to power. No Tae-woo, sorry. 1980s, 1988, and so on. So Koreans were reliant on third-generation performers, one of whom was Kim Yun-dok. Kim Yun-dok was the person who taught Hwang Byung-gi. So beyond the third generation. So the third generation was appointed, and the Sanjo schools come from there. However, Hwang Byung-gi in 1990 led a delegation of South Korean musicians and dancers to North Korea, where he was given cassette recordings of Chung Nam-hee performing a couple of years before he died in what was then the Pyongyang Music and Dance College. And so, for Hwang Byung-gi, the third generation becomes less important, and he throws Kim Yun-dok, his teacher, out from his story to create what he called the Chung Nam-hee Che Hwang Byung-gi Ryu. So the Hwang Byung-gi school in the style of Chung Nam-hee. So Kugak research when it comes to folk music becomes slightly stretched, and there are a number of different interpretations that can be placed on things. Now I notice that the Kugak research methodology has remained very much intact. There's just from 2015 examples of 6 recent master's theses. I've gone through 86 master's theses finished here between 2016 and 2024, and the same ideas, the same structural principles of Kugak research remain intact. Why is that a problem? Well, because musicology outside Korea and ethnomusicology has changed a lot. And what's happened is that a number of Korean scholars are saying that what we do in Korea is no longer the same as ethnomusicology. There are reasons why ethnomusicology has changed. As we go into the social, cultural, contextual things behind music making, which is what you do with Hallyu and many other things. You can see the sort of things that ethnomusicology has done, but here's a quote from the former director of the Asian Music Research Institute, the Dongyang Umak Yongguso, here in Seoul-dae. Ethnomusicology, a term which Western scholars coined in the 1950s to denote the study of non-Western music, doesn't apply to the disciplines here. Kugak then, and the understanding of Kugak has been localized. And why is that a challenge? Well, one of the challenges is that Koreans who go abroad, who studied Kugak here, and go abroad to complete doctorates, struggle to secure academic positions when they return to Korea. And that's very different to Koreans who study Western music here, who go abroad to study for doctorates, who come back and they're in demand. I know there's certain people here who don't have full-time professorships, but it's easier there. So there's a mismatch there, which is harming the younger generation of scholars. It's also common in European and North American universities for the supervisors to see a Korean and say, you should study Korean music. And so we get students who are both Kugak specialists and Western music specialists doing theses on Korean music who struggle when they come back here. 30 years ago, Lee Kon-yong, a member of the third generation of composers and latterly the president of the Korean National University of Arts, argued that all music performed by Koreans in Korea is Korean music. So Korean musicology, whether it's of what we might call K-classic or Kugak, should be unified. There shouldn't be prejudice towards people working in one or the other area. And this challenges what the notion of Kugak is. I've shown how it's broadened from court music to folk and to fusion, but if somebody studies, well, here are 3 papers just by one person, Hyung-yong, Hannah, Chung, just as examples. If somebody studies Protestantism and music, if somebody studies colonial circulations, classrooms, education and music, or how musicology in South Korea was influenced by people from North Korea coming down after 1945 and settling here. Is that Kugak or is it not? Is it related to Kugak or is it something totally separate? Are fusions, are AI or internet evolutions part of Kugak? So can and should Kugak remain separated from other Korean music in its study and practice? And can and should it remain separated from what ethnomusicologists are doing in much of the rest of the world. And with that, I come back to the National Kugak Promotion Act. If Kugak is to be promoted as traditional music, dance, plays, which are unique artistic expressions of our people, as well as performing arts that are reinterpretations and recreations of these, what's the border? What counts and what doesn't? For the Kugak Expo, what counts and what doesn't? Not just here, but with an expo, and when you try to work in the international scene, how do you define what counts and what doesn't count of, say, music from Bulgaria, Romania, former Soviet Union? How do you put the things together? So, how can the Kugak world not just be something from the past, but develop the vitality of Kugak in Korea and abroad today and in the future? Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your thorough research of the Korean researches of the cultural outsider, but I feel like a cultural insider perspective, and also providing a valuable insights into the evolution of Korean studies over such an extended period, and the Kugak 이론. If you have any question, please take notes into your question, and feel free to join in the Q&A session after second presentation. So I would introduce our final presenter that I would like to introduce is Professor Nancy Lau. She will speak classicism and inter-Asian collaboration in contemporary music. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Lau.
Thank you. It's great to be here and learning so much these couple of days. And I didn't realize my work is going to be related to Hanliu, but it's great to know that actually there's a connection. I hope you will see that too. Okay, so I was going to try to see whether we can hear some music first. So let's see whether it works. Okay. The first one was too soft, we can't hear it, so the second one. So with that sound in your mind, let's consider some of the issues that I want to address today. In contemporary concert music, intercultural collaboration has grown extremely common. New creativity is sparkled by when people collaborate, and music, by the very nature, is an art form that often exists in conjunction with other people. Intercultural collaboration provides an opportunity, artistic vision, sonic possibilities, or simply physical space for musicians of diverse cultural background to interact, thereby mutually enriching and transforming each other's artistic work while creating new practice. Intercultural collaboration refers fundamentally to the interaction between people of ethnically and culturally diverse societies. However, there exists a varying degree of difference and distance between collaborators' starting points in language and culture. Therefore, to explore further, we can consider intercultural collaboration as a relative phenomenon depending on the degree of distance between the collaborators' language and cultures. This is particularly useful when we consider the uniqueness of intercultural collaboration in concert music. Shared aspects of culture and language are salient in the Asian region, and it can shape the unfolding of a collaboration in significant ways. The notion of Asian culture in this situation does not work as a static frames to define the collaboration. Rather, Asian cultures in the contemporary mode are formed and realized as the collaborative process unfolds and are interactional and dynamic in nature. Intercultural musical collaboration between groups that share a high degree of similarity allow their participants to reflect on their own artistic practices in unusual ways. By focusing on musicians participating in this intercultural, inter-Asia collaboration, particularly, this paper hopes to dissuade readers from assigning the notion of cultural misappropriation or borrowing to such collaboration. The charge of cultural appropriation has in recent years been broadly applied to situations involving the adoption of elements of one culture by members of another culture, whereby the cultural elements are used outside of their original context. Yet, culture is never static or fixed. It is always evolving, changing, and transcending borders of different kinds. Keeping culture neatly separated from each other is not feasible in the quickly globalizing world. As Edward Said noted, the history of all cultures is the history of cultural borrowing. Cultures are not impermeable. The critique of cultural appropriation, unfortunately, tend to solidify the boundaries between culture rather than demystifying stereotypes. The critique of cultural appropriation upholds them and disallows the possibility of porous relationship between cultures. This paper considered the inter-Asia collaboration, whereby the participant taking serious interest in each other's cultural beliefs, values, aesthetics, and practices, which provides the basis for innovative and creative projects that contribute to mutual flourishing of different cultural groups. A few words about the notion of inter-Asia is in order. Inter-Asia was developed in the 1990s as a field of study and began the publication of its own journal in 2000, Journal of Inter-Asia Studies. Based on the premise that there is no cultural or linguistic unity in this imaginary space called Asia, the founding editors aimed instead to look toward relatively similar historical experiences shared in Asia, and to contribute to the contribute to the integration of imagined Asia at the level of knowledge production. And here's the key point: knowledge production is at risk here, in order to escape from its definition by the West. This term, inter-Asia, is used to refer to substantial exchange, dialogue, and movements beyond nation-state boundaries within the region. I emphasize that point because I've been writing about inter-Asia in the past few years, and I've often had people ask me the question whether Asia defined this way is stereotype, and I always have to put this out. I would also further suggest that Inter-East Asia exchanges and dialogues in music collaboration foster a kind of solidarity among musicians that is built on historical experience shared. This solidarity contributes to the Inter-East Asia imagining and Inter-East Asia sensibility. With two cases study, I hope to ponder on the notion in exploring the exchange and dialogue that benefit from the shared cultural heritage and common history on the one hand, and yet are distinguished by distinctive different histories and trajectories on the other. The solidarity stems from familiar yet different, shared yet distinctive. It plays a crucial role in sparking creativity by leveraging shared cultural background and historical context, while also embracing different and unique characteristics. Individuals can generate innovative solutions. Here, I'd like to borrow another concept from Bakhtin, which is the novelistic hybrid. It is particularly useful in such music dialogue in contemporary music. Bakhtin wrote, "The novelistic hybrid is an artistically organized system for bringing different languages in contact with one another, a system having at its goal the illumination of one language by means of another, the carving out of a living image of another language." Accordingly, different East Asian voices, concept, and performance practice can overlay or, more importantly, shed light on each other. We will consider two unique, interesting cases of such imagining. The first case is a collaboration between Chinese composer Zhou Wenzhong. I'm sorry, I didn't give that to you. Okay, so that's the text. Okay. The first case is a collaboration of Chinese composer Zhou Wenzhong and Gaigang master Ji Yongli on the composition for Korean traditional ensemble. During nearly 60 years of his composition career, composer Zhou Wenzhong did not write a single piece for non-European instrument. That is, not until he met and was commissioned by Ji Yongli. The important breakthrough was 2008, when he was 85 years old. He composed Eternal Pine for Korean instrumental ensemble. The second case is the collaboration of Korean composer Woon Suk-chin. Woon Suk-chin, whose career as a modern composer got an important boost around the early 1990s, also did not compose for a non-European instrument until he met Chinese Sheng virtuoso Wu Wei in Berlin. In 2009, when she was 48, almost 20 years after she became prominent, she completed the Concerto for Sheng and Orchestra, a major breakthrough, which remained her only major work for non-European instrument. It has been performed very impressively by more than 40 symphony orchestras around the world, including the most famous, such as New York Philharmonic, LA Philharmonic, and Boston Symphony Orchestra, and so on. Together, these two cases shed light on the power, I would claim, of inter-Asia collaboration. Now, how is inter-Asia collaboration in contemporary music connected to classicism, a European concept indeed? Classicism is a 19th century coinage originally used to describe a cultural war happening in France and later in Germany between, on the one hand, Romanticism, which emphasizes liberation from the restraints, and on the other, let me see, show this. On the other, an aesthetic and political program devoted to recreation of an ideal of spiritual beauty and artistic purity associated with an idealized classical Greek culture. By claiming to venerate and emulate the past, the classicists also necessarily reinvent and reimagine the past for self-projection and novel recreation. So every form of classicism, therefore, takes on the characteristics of its own time. So this notion of classicism could be useful in considering the transmission and transformation of elevated classical past and cultural memory in the works of composers of East Asia heritage. Example abounds and approaches varied frequently. We can find hybridization, fragmentation of cultural memories that reinvent and reimagine the cultural past. The East Asian classicism can be defined as a temporal experience instead of an ethnic or cultural essence. Here I use the notion of classicism as a crucial intervention to the usual concepts like nationalism, post-colonial theory, and Orientalism that are frequently applied to the study of East Asian composers. In my view, these usual theoretical concepts fall short in addressing the lived experiences of history and memory that shape, importantly, the work of this contemporary musician. In contrast, classicism centered on the agency of the individuals who draw from their cultural memory, knowingly or unknowingly. It sidesteps the problematics of authenticity and essence and considers these creations as always already making and doing of the present day. It addresses the notion of East Asian aesthetics as discursive, involving linguistic life, emotional dimension, embodied experience, and the sense of root. Classicism as a paradigm can take the analysis of contemporary music beyond the boundary of music, prompting us to imagine other patterns of semiotics at work. Elements associated with the long-established convention makes up cultural memory that constitute the legacy and gift, as well as the constraints for East Asian composers. So through indexing, mimicking, and creating symbolic connection, East Asian composers interpret classical past in the music logic of our time or simply their own. So let me go to the first case study. Zhou Wenzhong began his career as composer in New York City. Having grown up in an affluent family in China, he moved to United States in 1946 and later became a student of avant-garde composer Edward Varese. There, modernists form a vast web of connection linking composers, performers, artists, text, and institution, a kind of multitudinous weave. Zhou Wenzhong established his reputation very quickly. His orchestra work was premiered by San Francisco Symphony as early as 1953, no doubt the first one. And Louisiana Orchestra Commission in 1954 put him in company with luminaries such as Luigi Dalla Piccolo and Paul Hindemith. So he became a composition faculty at Columbia University for the next 35 years. So classical poetry has always been important to him. And this poetry, as you can see, really reveal a kind of inner space and a kind of impermanence of life. It depicts the infinitive space and time. So in 2009, when I asked Zhou Wenzhong why he had not composed for a Chinese instrument in his long career, and this, remind you, is a year after he had composed for Korean instrument. His answer was this: who am I? Church's reluctance to reveal is revealing the weight of complexity with his own cultural inheritance was too heavy. So the cultural indebtedness to classicism had been apparent and persistent. However, he cannot compose for Chinese instrument. In contrast, the inter-Asia connection to another respected tradition was less daunting. So when he was invited to compose for the Korean ensemble, he jumped on it and then create a wonderful work. And I don't have time to do this, but let me try what I can play just a little bit. So this is his belief when he write about composing for this. Let's see whether this will work. Okay, I need to move on. So Woonsuk Jin, it's widely available on YouTube. Woonsuk Jin and Wu Wei is a different story, and their reason for that is very different from Zhou Wenzhong. So Woonsuk Jin's music essentially led her to foster a different type of inter-Asia collaboration with Wu Wei. In Berlin, Woonsuk Jin studied with Ligeti and grew to become one of the most important influential composers of our time, recognized by numerous awards and commissions. She is well known for a modest composition style and very much famously for staying clear of association with Korean music tradition, not wanting her composition to give impression of exoticism or Orientalism. In the beginning, the excerpt you heard was from this piece. And she said, I understand myself not as a Korean composer, but as a composer who is part of the international music culture and intensely imprinted with European tradition, not only of the 20th century. What terribly disturbed me is the fact that composer from East Asia becomes automatically afflicted with the cliche of East Asian music. So her reservation had kept her from composing for Asian instrument for a long time. And then she said, this is also very important. As a composer of modern music, Woonsuk Jin was also very explicit about how she's never satisfied with European orchestra sound. In the interview, she said, in my opinion, the conventional orchestra setting in European reflect of the 19th century, although there are, of course, great master work written for it. So I often call for an array of extra instruments. Through this, I always try to introduce a completely different color into my composition based on my experience of non-European music. This experience of non-European music sound stemmed from her cultural memories. Growing up in Korea, Woonsuk Jin was influenced by the soundscape of Asia. For example, she very much taken to the gamelan sound. The rich possibility of Sheng offer Woonsuk Jin a sonic horizon and potential that align with her creative energy, modernist concept and aesthetic ideal. The cultural proximity of the region ignite this imagination. So this is the last slide I want you to read. So this is from her. Unlike Korean and Japanese counterpart, the Chinese sheng, which is more than 4,000 years old, has been developed into a modernized and highly versatile instrument. Because of the key mechanism, it has the potential for chromaticism, microtone, chorus, polyphony, cluster, and so on. At times, it can sound like electroacoustic music. An instrument is capable of erased sound and of explosive power. Despite of the extreme possibilities, I think you have to be careful to preserve the very nature of sheng, not to destroy the essence of the instrument. And I think that's a very important point to really think about how, despite her distance from the Asian kind of a connection, she respects them. The last thing I want to show you is actually another thing that she said. She said that I heard the sound of sheng when I was a child. It was a long, long time ago. I was dreaming one day to write a piece for it. So maybe in my whole life, I have some inspiration for this concerto. So the working process went very well. I needed just 8 weeks. It's amazing. It's 29 minutes of music of this huge orchestra piece. And only 8 weeks she completed it. So encountering Wu Wei's virtuoso playing opened a new range of possibility for her. And she said, I think without Wu Wei, I would not have written this piece. He can do everything, complex chord, glissando, and microtones. And if I can just indulge 1 more minute of what Wu Wei have to say about this, you can say that this is a description from Wu Wei from the interview I had with him. He talks about how it's a kind of phoenix. The sound becomes such a powerful thing and rebirth like a phoenix. And if you know something about sheng or siwang, it's actually a rendition of phoenix. So this kind of inter-East Asia music solidarity involve both convergence and divergence of tradition. I argue that the significance collaboration created inter-Asian imagining that illuminate one music language by means of another, the carving out of a living image of another language. It is the inter-East Asia collaboration that helped Zhou Wenzhong and Woon-Suk Ching unlock the key to express their long-held aesthetic ideal. Their work take these two musicians into a familiar yet refreshing new realm. These composers and musicians render the classicism using their contemporary sensibility, skill, and inter-Asia imagination. And last, I will leave you with this quote from Zhou Wenzhong. In 1979, Zhou Wenzhong addressed Asian Contemporary Composer Society at the National Guggenheim Center. He said, "I'm more concerned with watching how fundamental Asian concepts and practices are gradually and unobtrusively being integrated into the mainstream of Western contemporary music." He certainly accomplished that, as did Woon-Suk Ching. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your interesting research and thought-provoking findings about inter-Asian collaboration in the contemporary music, which is so interesting. So we will now begin our Q&A and discussion session. So if you have any question, please raise your hands. Are there any questions? We have a 20 minutes Q&A, so yeah, feel free to join. Any comments or thoughts? I saw there are some of the musicologists who are engaging with this topic, professors and some lecturers and students, and over composers here.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your great presentation. And as I know, there is lots of many of Korean and then another Chinese, Japanese, and then Southeast Asian musician collaborations. And then have you checked about that? It's not only just the Jinun-suk's Senghwang. Actually, the Jinun-suk performed composed lots of millions, zillion, billion, trillions of Western music. Just one of them. It is not a great symbol. It is not. It's just as I see it, Jinun-suk's work is just one swallow. One swallow does not make spring. So it's not the matter. And then there is a lot of collaboration with Korean and then Asian. Have you checked about that?
Thank you for this remark. Indeed, there's as I said at the very beginning of my talk, that it's a very commonplace of this collaboration. But what I have felt that's lacking is a way to think about why that collaboration is so fruitful. And there's a lot of discussion about interculture. But interculture, as I mentioned earlier, that there is a degree of collaboration, and I really am intrigued by this notion of familiarity in terms of connection. So that's what the particular point I'm addressing.
Thank you very much. Very illuminating and comforting sometimes. Sometimes very conflicting to me. I am not an expert in music at all. I don't know anything about it. But then, what reminded me from your presentations is the two conflicting tendencies in your presentations. One is Mr. Howard's presentation is more or less, let's say, nationalistic kind of tendency within Kugak tradition, which you obviously discourage and encouraged to be more international or global. While Professor Rao's paper is completely opposite. It's more or less inter-Asia kind of collaboration in music, whether it's a performance or a composition. That reminds me of the implications of your presentation for the establishment of a Korean identity in the long run. I think Korean society is now faced with this kind of conflicting sources of identity formation. Particularly, Mr. Howard, what would you suggest in more concrete terms if indeed Kugak tradition would like to go beyond the nationalistic tendency?
I think there are arguments going on here, which I wouldn't want to intervene and say anything about. And I don't feel it's my responsibility to tell Koreans what to do. However, there is a problem outside Korea, and the problem is that many Kugak scholars are submitting articles to journals which are being rejected, or are submitting papers for conferences which are being rejected. And I think it's important that the Kugak world understands what's going on. How they choose to resolve it, that's up to you. I want to promote Kugak because it's wonderful music. And so I want to promote the study of Kugak. And I know this is a very delicate balance, but it's not for me as a white or something like a white person to tell you as yellow, no, it's not my responsibility, or rather it's not my right to tell you what to do.
I feel so very fortunate to be here, to have learned from all of these amazing scholars, and especially I felt this was quite a treat to get a kind of autobiography from you, Professor Howard, because I've studied your work for so long. I'm trying to think about how to articulate this question. The part of your presentation that kind of broke my heart was when you said there were these scholars that, I don't remember their names, I apologize, but they omitted certain parts of the kind of vocal recordings of these artists because they were not correct, or they didn't follow certain. So that made me wonder, when something is, especially with something that's so embodied, like a vocal tradition, when something like that is lost, how do you recover that? You know what I mean? It's almost like a kind of a shamanistic question, because you do the songs of the shamans, which was my first entry into your work. The idea that the shamans bring back the voices of people that have been gone, that have gone, and that's one of their ways of kind of preserving traditions through their various songs. I'm thinking about that, and I'm wondering if you have seen instances of recovery of things that might have been lost.
Yes. Sorry, is that working? No. Yes. So yes, but I should say first of all that this is not just a Korean problem. In my own country, folk songs were collected, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. There were huge arguments as to whether you should record them as they were or whether you should make them fit modes. Even dance, English Morris dancing? Some of you do. Well, I live near a village called Adderbury, which is very well known for Morris dancing, and its dances were collected by a person called Cecil Sharp 100 years ago. And every April, there's a dance day where two Morris sides, two groups, dance. One side says, we perform the dances as Cecil Sharp recorded them. The other side says, we perform the dances as the person who taught Cecil Sharp did them. And they circle around the village, meet in the centre, where they basically have a fight, even though it's a fight with dance. So these are common issues. It's not just in Korea. Now I can't remember the other bit of your question. Right, but how do you revive it? there are examples of revival all over the place. And actually, if you think of what's happened in Korea, as I was trying to show there, it was not inevitable that Kugak would be a sound world that survived. It has, and although it's got challenges, it's very much a part of Korea and part of a Korea that's known abroad as well as here. So you're not doing too badly here, quite frankly.
Excuse me, let me have another question to Professor Rao. It's more or less a very general question, obviously. That is you talked about collaborative works in inter-Asian music genre. Then I'm wondering whether there is any level of, let's say, collaboration. In other words, in terms of a full synthesis of two or more than two musics or traditions, or lesser level, maybe it's just a juxtaposition of the two things without much synthesis or something. So I'm sort of familiar to Hegelian notion of synthesis, but then I always thought that synthesis is only possible in the world of art, not in realities, in social science field, something. So I would like to know whether there are degrees of a collaboration in terms of inter-Asian music collaboration.
I think it is true. There's a lot of things that collaboration is worthwhile to study from many angles and different degrees. And I actually have written an essay on the different ways of collaboration can work, and different points of entry and different ways of hierarchy and whatever trust that there needs to be and whatever things. So I think it's really a complex issue. But one of the reasons that I am attracted to these case studies is because these two composers just stay away from composing for so long. And it's this kind of intercultural, inter-Asia type of connection that, unlock it. And to me, in those kind of collaboration, there were a lot of give and take. And I think in many ways, both performers were extremely grateful. In fact, Wu Wei did say, to this day, Won Suk Chin's concerto for Sheng is still the best concerto that's ever been written. And so I think that's powerful testimony to the work.
I would answer there's no one correct way. So some collaborations don't result in fusion, some do. So for the Korean audience, one of the examples of the ones which don't result in fusion is actually Samulnori. And Samulnori in the 1980s and 1990s produced some albums with particularly German and Austrian musicians. And if you listen to them, Samulnori remains Samulnori. The Austrian stuff remains Austrian. More recently, there's been some collaborations between, there's an Australian jazz percussionist, Simon Barker, and there was a film, Muyong Munaje Pershibo. Yeah. And he has collaborated with some Korean musicians. Kim Dong-won is one. And the Pansori singer, is it Cho? Anybody help me? I can't remember. Where things go very well together, and you don't feel that one is remaining Australian or Korean. Other examples in Korea, some of the things which would be called fusion, where you have Western and Korean going together. The group Shinawi, which Kim Ji-hae is sitting there, who was the percussionist for a few years, seems, this is 5-10 years ago, they were doing things which really matched very well. And you didn't feel there was any sense of this being more Kugak and more Western. And there are other examples like that. So I think there's a spread here. And I wouldn't say that one is right and one is wrong. There's all sorts of opportunities, if you like.
And if I can add, one thing that's really interesting to me is also the audience reaction. So Wu Wei has, collaborated with some like 40 orchestra in different halls, and he mentioned that in each hall is something different, and the audience perception depend on their position, depend on the stadium, they react differently to the pieces. So I think a cultural fusion can really totally be understood or analyzed, studied from the perception perspective, and that's yet another way of thinking about this.
Okay, so unfortunately we are out of time, so we need to wrap up our discussion. Yeah, if you want to talk more, please join our round table session afterwards. And we also have the wonderful event afterwards, is dinner. And thank you all for your participation, question and comments. And yeah, I hope that our today's talk will enhance our contemporary music studies. Thank you very much.